Hello everyone, welcome back to Unraveling Politics, a weekly political analysis show. We are going to be covering the second Trump administration's first year in office. This episode is mostly going to focus on foreign and trade policy. We covered domestic policy last episode, so check that out if you haven't already. So I'm going to start with something I didn't mention last episode, and that is the so-called Department of Government Efficiency. A friend suggested that I should have mentioned Doge, and the reason I didn't is because I'm not really aware of any of the cuts that Doge has signed into law other than $9 billion that Congress approved. So that's how much Doge saved, $9 billion. And don't forget all the people that were haphazardly fired and the economic damage that was done in local communities when grants were cut off. So in reality, Doge cost us way more money than it saved. And then the claims of several hundred billion that were saved are absolutely false and have no basis in reality. If anything, I did the Trump administration a favor by leaving Doge out of my review. So we're going to be looking at taking a trip around the world this episode. We're going to start with U.S. tariff policy, then move to Latin America, then over to Asia, the Middle East, Europe, and Greenland, and then back here to sum it all up. And sorry, Africa, I don't really think there's anything to cover there. At least nothing important that the administration has directly done. And before we move on, if you have not seen last episode where I covered domestic affairs, check that out when you're done. This one, it doesn't really matter which one you watch first. This is really a part 2 to that series. So let's start with tariffs. Tariffs were probably the biggest tool of the Trump administration since last January. If you don't know what a tariff is, we really don't have time to explain it here, and that's basically a tax on an import. If you need more information, plenty of it online. The U.S. tariff rate used to be very, very low overall broadly. It was, I believe, in the low single digits overall, and now I think we're at near 20%, which is the highest since the 1930s. And I don't have time to explain the back and forth of what it was, every single time it went up and down. I'm going to sum up what tariff rates are as we stand, just mention a few big ones. So nearly every country has a 10 to 15% baseline tariff. 10% is countries we have certain trade deals with, 15% is the flat rate across the world. That's quite high already, and some countries have the higher quote-unquote reciprocal tariffs and then the additional fees, as Trump would call them. For example, Brazil has a 10% flat rate, but an additional 40% rate because of free speech, which was Trump claiming that Brazil doesn't have free speech. Because they were jailing political opponents. That's a story for another time. Canada is tricky because there is a lot of exemptions under the USMCA trade deal, as with Mexico. They have a 10% rate on energy and 35% on all products that are not exempted. China has about a 44% tariff rate, and then they've placed tariffs on us. Well, they almost restricted rare earth and other critical mineral exports. Trump has threatened 25% tariffs on Denmark, the UK, Norway, Sweden, and the Netherlands, and some other countries. And currently, we have a 15% tariff rate on items from the European Union, with some exceptions. India has 50% tariffs. Japan has a trade deal, so 15% tariffs on some items and 0% on others. Mexico has a 25% tariff on duty-free items under the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. Russia has no tariffs, which is really strange. They have no tariffs. However, a bill passing through Congress has proposed 500% tariffs on Russia. And I don't really understand why we have to go through Congress for this, because if the administration claims it can unilaterally impose tariffs, then why not they just do it? They either can do it or they can't do it. So I would think they should just do it. And actually, I suggested 1,000% tariffs on Russia, and that should have been done 4 years ago. 15% tariffs on South Korea with some exceptions. The UK has a 10% tariff rate because of a trade deal, and then they're going to have additional tariffs because of the Greenland situation. And then there are certain tariffs on across the world on things like aluminum, cars, auto parts, copper, and other metals like steel, and so much more. So the effects of the tariffs remain muted at the moment. The worst fears of stagflation and depression have not come true, and I don't think they will. But the biggest concern I have is not really economic, it's more political. And that's the loss of our soft power, which is the ability to persuade other countries to do things without military force, which would be hard power. And our peak of soft power was probably in the 1990s when the Cold War ended, and I would say it really declined during the Bush administration with the Iraq War. We don't really have time to get into it, but Iraq really damaged our credibility, and to us Americans, we think, oh, well, that was Bush, but to other countries around the world, they think that was all of us. And the same thing is true here. Once Trump is gone, the rest of the world is not going to reset, or at least not by and large. They're not going to say let bygones be bygones. Some certain countries might, but not all of them. The benefits of these tariffs, I would say, is the revenue it raised, and the Treasury claims that it raised about $287 billion last year, which, if we hadn't done the irresponsible tax cuts, would be a dent into plugging our massive deficit of $2 trillion a year. But tariffs alone are not going to cover even the cost of the tax cuts, so it's really not a good strategy. And lastly, the administration claims that the falling trade deficit is a sign of their tariff success, except this is also not true because it has not been nearly long enough for countries to relocate. I'm no supply chain expert, but I can't imagine that 9 months is enough time for a company to relocate thousands of miles away to here. And besides, much of what was imported early in the year, the overall trade level remains about as high as it always was. So no successes there. We're very few, I guess. All right, let's move on to Latin America. The Trump administration has really pressed hard on Latin America, seeing it as a sphere of influence. And if I may defend the administration, this is not a new idea. It began under the Monroe administration 200 years ago, and it was really prominent during the Cold War when we overthrew a bunch of democracies in Latin America. For example, Chile, we overthrew the socialists there. The biggest success, I would say, is the deportations, and a lot of people don't like it, but I have loved sending illegal gang members to El Salvador. It has been fantastic. I think it's a great idea, and I hope we do more of it. And I'm sorry, but if you're working here illegally, stealing a social security number, taking a job, getting your kids educated for free, I have very little sympathy for you, gang member or not. Goodbye. Another success, I would say, is the polarizing overthrow of Nicolas Maduro. The overthrow was long overdue, and it was a good idea, and that's coming from someone who's a very isolationist like myself. However, what comes next might not be. We have to wait and see on that one. Was the attack illegal? Yes. However, the Biden administration itself raised the bounty on Maduro's capture to I believe it was $20 million. Biden or Kamala would have never done this, and it's universally agreed in the Western world that Maduro had to go. What remains to be seen is what comes next. If all we do is let the dictatorship remain, and we just extract oil, in the theory that might be fine, but it's definitely a moral outrage, and I think Venezuelans in this country who are voters, who fled to this country, and many of them who voted for Trump, are going to be very angry at that. So it could be a political problem in the months and years ahead. So let's move to Asia across the Pacific. The trade war with China was probably the biggest part of last year with Asian politics. And I think what is concerning is that the approval of the U.S. around the world, it started off low during the last Trump administration. It rose during the Biden administration, and China stayed down here, stayed fairly low. And then when Trump came back into office, China went up and the U.S. went down. And Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, has redirected a lot of his efforts, saying that the U.S. is not a stable country anymore. And he's saying that China will be leading the New World Order, and that Canadians and the rest of the world need to take things, quote, as they are and not as we wish they would be. The only good news from East Asia is investment that Trump has secured from Japan and South Korea. Once again, the actual implementation remains a mystery. China hasn't invaded Taiwan yet, so that's actually pretty good. Moving to the Middle East, and this is where I might lose some of you if you haven't been lost already, and I've made it clear many times before, but if you're a new viewer, I'll say this again. I'm deeply isolationist, which applies to every country on earth. What I was naively hoping was that this administration was going to cut off aid to Gaza and they were going to restrict aid to Israel. I didn't think it was going to happen, but I was hoping for it. And I mean all of the aid. This is not our problem. It should have never been. We didn't draw the lines. We didn't create this problem, but we have been responsible in participating in it. Isolationist doesn't mean do nothing. For example, Operation Midnight Hammer, which was the attack on Iran's nuclear facilities. I believe that was a huge success. The exact damage is not known, and we will probably never know, but it does seem that Iran's progress to a nuclear weapon has been halted somewhat. And the conflict between the U.S. and Iran, the Cold War, if you will, is really a long story, and there's been lots of protests and there's talk of regime change. I do think there will be regime change in the future. I just don't know when that will be. But anyway, that's a story for another time. As for the conflict between Israel and Hamas, the war is not over, and even if the current fighting does end, the war itself will not be ending. This conflict has been 80 years in the making. It was the British that drew the line, not us. And I believe it should be the British and the people who actually created this mess be the one to solve it. And the idea that one president could come in and fix it was always ludicrous. Moving to Europe, and this is where we get to Ukraine. In Europe, his record of success is muted. I guess this depends on your political views about war and peace. Europe has committed to raising defense spending to 5% of GDP, which is up from about 2%. Prior to the invasion of Ukraine, half of Europe was spending less than 2%, and some were spending less than 1% of GDP. And I think most European countries were heading toward 5% anyway, or at least 3%. Last year, they committed to getting to 3.5% by 2030. And I know Trump he wants to push it to 5%. That was not unthinkable, but it certainly wasn't a shock. So when it was announced, it was like, oh, okay, but it wasn't like, didn't expect that to happen. Also, this is where I get to say I do not want to spend 5% of our GDP on defense. I'd rather spend it on 2% or less because we don't need a large military. If one, they keep failing their audits, the Defense Department has failed its audits 8 years in a row, and two, if we are in alliances like NATO, we don't need to have a large military all on our own. We have allies. That's the whole point. Instead of allies using us, we should be using them. Anyway, I don't consider that to be an achievement, but if this is something you like, then this would be a win in that box. Also, this is not really an achievement, it's more of a promise. The Trump administration wants to raise defense spending to $1,500 billion, which would be $1.5 trillion, which shows the administration is heading for higher military spending in the years ahead. So this leads me to Ukraine, and I have been utterly appalled by this, and I think basically everyone should be, because there's two schools of thought, and Trump has failed at both of them, no matter what way you look at it. The first school is that we should be defending Ukraine. That's the Biden administration way. It wasn't working, but it was something. And obviously, you'd be upset because Trump has cut off Ukraine several times, only to restart aid and intelligence sharing. It's been very haphazard and chaotic. The second school of thought, which is the one that I come from, is that you let Ukraine and Russia duke it out. Not our problem. And as I have said for the last 2 years, I do not support Ukraine. I want them to win, but I don't want to spend our blood or treasure to make it happen. Not supporting Ukraine is not the same thing as supporting Russia, and I want to stay out of this. If any of you are listening who want to support Ukraine, I have something for you. I'd like you to visit the website. I'll put it right here if you're on YouTube. It is www.ildu.com.ua. It will take you to a link where you can click the Join Now button, and you can give them your information, give them your phone number, your address, and then let them know as when you can get to Ukraine. You can join the Ukrainian army, and you can defend Ukraine that way. Once again, it is www.ildu.com.ua. You can join the Ukrainian army, and if you can send me a video of you on the battlefield, then I will show it on the show, and then we can support Ukraine. So it sounds good to me. So if you guys could do that would be great. If you believe we should send our treasure or even our blood to Ukraine, then I want to see you sign up and you do it first, because it is absolutely unacceptable. And if you subscribe to this school of thought, you should be horrified as well, because we have not left these powers to duke it out themselves. Instead, we've done the worst of both, which is where we are involved, but not for a good reason. The administration claims they're making peace, but they've made no progress toward peace. They say they're 95% of the way there as of this recording, but they are 95% means basically zero, because Russia has not conceded anything. And at this rate, they're not going to. Why would they? Because they're winning. And I think everything that's happened foreign policy-wise in this Russia-Ukraine conflict has been the worst of the worst. Even I think the tariffs are better than this. He said he'd end the war on day one or sooner, and it wasn't a flub, he repeated it multiple times. I never expected he would, but it's still a promise he made and a promise he broke. So let's move to Greenland. This flared up in 2025, and it kind of went away, and then now it's back again for certain reasons. There's three ways to measure success here. Either one, Greenland becomes a part of the US. Two, Greenland is allowing us to build more military bases or expand the one we have now. We have a very small military base, about 150 people. And I believe it's in the western part of Greenland. Or number three, we're on the way to getting there. And supporters of the administration would say, oh, well, we're on the way of getting there. Except, no, we're not. Neither of these things have happened, and we are further away than ever before, pissing our allies off even more. A poll by CNN, which I linked in the description, shows 3/4 of Americans disapprove of taking control of the territory. Democrats and independents are completely against it. Meanwhile, Republicans are divided. And I think what's really interesting is in the Republican Party, you have the more traditional neocon Bush-era conservatives that are more interventionist foreign policy, and then you have the new America First members like Marjorie Taylor Greene until very recently. Trump uses the rhetoric of the second one, but has the actions of the first while still annoying the neocons. It's fascinating because it seems like a recipe that would have no support whatsoever, and that's basically where we're at. The America First members don't support intervention as much as the neocons, and the neocons don't like intervention using America First as the guise. They also are not a fan of the autocratic behavior, so no success here. So that brings us back to the US. And in fairness to the administration, they did give some military equipment to Ukraine. Once again, I don't support that, but they didn't completely pull the plug as I thought they would on January 20th of last year. The military did reach its recruitment targets for the first time in years. Here's where I give another swipe at Biden, by the way. If you haven't seen, I got this here. He should look familiar. If you're on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, you're not going to know what this is, but it's a not super nice depiction of Joe Biden. But anyway, under the Biden administration, the diversity training and the vaccine mandates really drove people away, and now they're back. So that is a success. They also gave service members a $1,776 bonus at the end of last year, and it remains to be seen what this Board of Peace to end the war in Gaza will look like. However, we'll have to wait and see what happens in the second year of the administration. Perhaps we'll have to do this again in a year. However, if I had to grade the foreign policy of this administration, it would be an F. From an isolationist perspective, it has been absolutely horrific. If you had told me everything that was going to happen a year ago, and you had asked me, what do you think of this? I would have said, no way. No way. But here we are. And it has been even more expansionist than I could have ever imagined. And if I was an expansionist, then I would say this would actually be pretty good. But even the way it's been done has been horrific. And usually I'm an ends justifies the means kind of person. I don't really care how something is done as long as the right thing is done. So capturing Maduro, for example, I didn't really care if we negotiated or notified Congress. Maduro had to go. There was bipartisan support for ending his regime. Therefore, I was pleased we went in and out. Nobody died. We didn't lose any military equipment. Well, nobody died on our side anyway. There's exceptions, of course, but that's generally my insight. That's the insight to my worldview. Overall, though, grading the whole presidency, including what we covered last episode, I would give it a D or a D minus. And I give less weight to foreign affairs, so even if I loved everything that Trump had done abroad, I would still say it was a D or maybe a C minus. Except for immigration, this has been a huge failure. Things are not much better in any way at all, and of course, the great irony here is the one thing I approve the administration of doing, handling illegal immigration, is something the public are completely against. So I know I'm the exception and not the rule. And the only other success that the administration would claim is that they've lowered oil prices, except they have done very little to do this. It was mostly OPEC. They increased oil production. They restricted oil production during the Biden administration, and now they've expanded it, which is why gas prices are lower. Not really anything to do with the president. And I think the biggest concern for the years ahead is the erosion of checks and balances. And this has been going on for many decades. Every president, really, since I'd say Franklin Delano Roosevelt, as someone who thought he was one of our greatest, really every president since him in some way, with maybe the exceptions of Eisenhower, have really tried to expand the power of the federal government. And the president, during these last few decades, has tried to subvert the other two branches in some way, shape, or form. Obama with DACA, Biden with the student loan forgiveness scam, and Trump with everything. Yet if you ask MAGA supporters, this is what they wanted. But I'd like to remind them, when a Democrat comes into office, whether that be in 3 years, in 7 years, 11 years, or however many years it is, they better be ready to take it on the chin as well when they do the same thing. All right, so that is it for now. Thank you for tuning in as always. If you are new to this show, please, and you like it, please share with your friends, your family, and anybody else in your life. And subscribe and let me know your thoughts in the comments below. So I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.